Pressure builds for Britain to follow through on the EU referendum result and officially quit the European Union. David Cameron has already made it clear it's up to his successor to begin Brexit talks as he made his last appearance at Armed Services Day as Prime Minister. The man many tipped to be his successor, Boris Johnson, has made no comment about a Brexit timetable. He spent the day playing cricket. But the foreign ministers of the EU's 6 founding members say they want negotiations now, and the UK should stop dragging its feet.
We need to turn the page. We don't want a vacuum, and it's important now that these negotiations with the United Kingdom start in good faith, but as soon as possible.
One of Britain's top EU officials, Lord Hill, resigns, saying out activists have no clear vision of life after Brexit. But Vote Leave campaigners at Westminster say it won't be rushed into beginning negotiations.
I spoke to constituents and they said, how long do you think it'll take? I said it might take between 2 and 4 years, and they were happy that at the end of that process they would have an independent country.
Meanwhile, the Scottish Government draws up legislation to enable a second independence vote in the wake of the Brexit referendum.
Good morning, everyone.
A very good evening to you. 2 days after the EU referendum result, the Vote Leave campaign says there's no rush to start negotiations with Brussels on the UK leaving the European Union. But Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon says Westminster is in political turmoil and there's a vacuum of leadership, as David Cameron's successor won't be known until October. There's growing impatience in parts of Europe that Britain isn't moving faster to begin its withdrawal from the EU. Here's our political correspondent, Ben Wright.
Still in office, but losing power. David Cameron doesn't rule like he did. Defeated in his fight to keep Britain in the EU, the Prime Minister watched an Armed Forces Day parade in Lincolnshire. While the EU demands decisions, Mr Cameron is in no position to make. But for Leave supporters at this parade in Romford, a day to revel in victory.
Lovely.
Yes,
That's just what we wanted.
Why is that?
Because we remember the old days.
And we don't like being bossed about.
Very good, very confident that we're out. Really pleased with the vote.
Those who led the Leave campaign were keeping their heads down. Boris Johnson, unusually quiet. Michael Gove, polite.
Hello, very nice to see you.
But brief. So a day after the UK voted to quit the EU and the Prime Minister pledged to resign, who's in charge?
The Prime Minister remains in charge. The government remains committed to a big programme we set out in the Queen's speech, and we were elected just a year ago.
In truth, politics is on hold. The Chancellor, George Osborne, has tweeted but hasn't been seen since Thursday, despite the turmoil on the markets. For government ministers who fought to remain, this is a weekend of serious soul-searching. But the consequences of Britain's decision are coming into focus fast. Not least in Scotland, which voted to remain in the EU. The First Minister said she wanted immediate discussions with Brussels to protect its place in Europe.
As Westminster is engulfed in political turmoil and as a vacuum of leadership develops, I want to make clear that Scotland is led by a stable and effective government.
As far as the EU is concerned, leave is leave.
The British people have spoken and the answer is we're out.
And the UK should now immediately begin negotiations to go. But yesterday, David Cameron said he would not trigger the formal process for leaving the European Union. That will be a job for his successor, expected in place by the autumn. So, what happens next? Today, Vote Leave said the dust should settle over the summer and informal talks could start. But there's very little evidence of a detailed plan. Leaving the EU will not be quick or simple. There are new trade deals to do and countless laws to unpick.
I spoke to constituents and they said, how long do you think it'll take? I said it might take between 2 and 4 years, and they were happy that at the end of that process they would have an independent country that they could hand on to their children. And this place, Parliament, would be the sovereign government.
So let's get on with it then, cry some EU leaders like this man, the President of the European Parliament.
Offen gestanden, ich finde das skandalös.
Frankly speaking, I find it scandalous. Once again, the whole continent is being held hostage by the internal deliberations of Great Britain's Conservatives.
A vote that split the country has left many delighted, the other half despondent. But the referendum itself was the easy part. Leaving the European Union is uncharted territory. Its impact on us, on the EU, impossible to guess. Ben Wright, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, it's clear EU leaders are urging Britain to implement its decision to leave as soon as possible. Speaking after a meeting in Berlin, foreign ministers from the 6 founding nations of the EU said the referendum marked a watershed moment in European history. Meanwhile, the UK's European Commissioner, Lord Hill, who oversees financial services at the EU's executive body, says he'll resign. Here's our Europe correspondent, Damian Grammaticus.
Pointing the way ahead, Germany's foreign minister, and surrounding him, his counterparts from the EU's founding nations. Europe is moving to close ranks. Today they demanded the UK begin the process soon to withdraw from the Union.
We need to turn the page. We don't want a vacuum, and it's important now that these negotiations with the United Kingdom start in good faith, but as soon as possible.
Angela Merkel said there was no need for talks to get nasty, and she understood that the UK needed time to appoint a new Prime Minister.
Frankly speaking, it shouldn't take forever, but I wouldn't pick a fight over a short period of time.
The European Union Treaty says that any member state can decide to leave the Union. To do so, it has to notify the other members officially, so it's only the UK which can start the process, not the EU or the other members. But in Brussels, the UK's influence is already waning. Lord Hill, the UK's one European Commissioner, seen here at the time of his appointment, today said he's stepping down.
I think that it's not possible for me to carry on properly. You have to listen to the will of the British people that's been expressed, and I have been very clear that the right thing to do is to stand down.
Appointed by David Cameron, his position, overseeing financial services markets in the EU, was untenable. Lord Hill says before the negotiations over the UK's separation can start, Britain needs a clear idea of the deal it wants to secure now.
People clearly have to do quite a lot of hard thinking as to what approach they want to take in those negotiations, what economic model they want to have, what relationship they want to have in the future with the EU and with the single market. And at the moment, I don't think the Leave side have done that work. It was clear throughout the campaign they didn't know the answer to that question. So I think they've got to put their thinking caps on and then work out how they think things can be organised in the future.
So already events are moving forward. It's the logic of Brexit, and whether the UK officially begins the process or not, it seems clear decisions will start to be made without its input. Damien Grammaticus, BBC News, Brussels.
Well, as we've heard, the Scottish Cabinet held an emergency meeting today in the wake of the Brexit result and is now preparing legislation for a possible second referendum on independence. The First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, said the government in Holyrood would hold immediate discussions with officials in Brussels to explore possible options to protect Scotland's place in the European Union. 62% of Scottish voters backed Remain in the EU referendum. Our Scotland editor, Sarah Smith, has more.
Nicola Sturgeon led an emergency meeting of the Scottish Cabinet today, where they agreed to officially begin preparing for another vote on independence.
A second independence referendum is clearly an option that requires to be on the table, and it is very much on the table. Steps will be taken now to ensure that the necessary legislation is in place.
Nicola Sturgeon certainly sounds like she is getting ready for another referendum. But whatever the SNP decide, whatever the Scottish people want, it's not up to her to call another vote. She would still have to ask for permission from the UK Prime Minister, whoever that may be by then. And that's not the only hurdle on the rocky road to independence. Brexit makes the arguments for leaving the UK even more complicated.
With the United Kingdom leaving the European Union, that raises all sorts of questions about the border between Scotland and the rest of Britain, of UK. What would happen in terms of the free movement of peoples? What about trade between Scotland and England? All of that would be dependent on negotiations, things that you simply couldn't just take for granted.
The SNP hope that Scottish voters, frustrated at the EU result, might now change their minds about remaining part of the United Kingdom. Even a former Labour First Minister says he would change his vote.
I'm a passionate European and I would now back the European Union over continuing membership of the United Kingdom. And England is a very different country now. They are diverging politically, and we've seen all this kind of trickle-down racism, this xenophobia, this emerging nationalism. It's a country I don't recognise, and I'm bitterly disappointed in Britain that we've taken this decision. So therefore, in terms of Scotland, it's got to reassess and I think take a very different direction.
A direction that feels as if it is heading towards a second vote on Scottish independence, when Scots will have to choose if they want to leave the EU or leave the UK. Sarah Smith, BBC News, Edinburgh.
The Republican presidential hopeful Donald Trump is on his second day of a visit to Scotland. He met with Rupert Murdoch and his new wife, Jerry Hall, at one of his golf clubs in Aberdeenshire. Mr. Trump says leaving the EU could affect US investments in the UK, but that ultimately Britain would be fine. Yesterday, he welcomed Britain's Brexit vote. And the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn says he won't stand down if there's a leadership challenge against him. He'd been accused of not working hard enough for the Remain campaign. He made the remarks after delivering a speech in central London where he called for a rational debate about immigration in the wake of the referendum result. He said many deprived communities where people voted leave had felt abandoned. He said nasty, divisive politics had led to people blaming immigrants for the problems facing their areas. Our political correspondent Alex Forsyth has the story.
The morning after a momentous day in British politics, and the Labour leaders feeling the repercussions too.
Is it time to resign?
Jeremy Corbyn's facing pressure from some of his own MPs for his role in the referendum campaign. But today, at a speech in London, he said he'd worked hard, done all he could, and Labour must now talk about immigration, protect workers' rights, not indulge in a fight over its leader.
In the past 24 hours, 140,000 people have said they do not want the party to spend the next 2 months debating the leadership of the party. They want the party to get on the front foot, get out there, explain what the Tories have done to the heartlands of this country.
But in its heartlands, Labour's accused of failing to connect with voters during this campaign on the issues that mattered.
So what's you thinking?
Immigration.
Today at London's Gay Pride March, alongside much support, Jeremy Corbyn faced anger.
You ran on a platform of mobilising the North and working class votes, and you failed considerably.
And some MPs agree key communities feel overlooked.
They're not feeling, that Labour is speaking to them. And so what we have to do, and what Jeremy has to do, is understand the problems those and pressures those communities are facing, but more than that, come up with the ideas of how we're going to address it. And I don't think we're hearing that.
A handful of Labour MPs have said they have no confidence in their leader. They could debate that here on Monday. But the party's rules make it very difficult for MPs to oust a leader, especially one with such support from the membership. And Jeremy Corbyn has said he will fight any challenge.
Some say Labour should unite behind its leader to reassure disaffected voters.
I think Labour needs to be concentrating to demand that the government gives guarantees that wages will be protected, that jobs will be protected. That's the sort of stuff that ordinary people want to hear, not an infighting among MPs.
Whatever this man's future, this is a party still divided, struggling to find direction and connect with those voters who feel overlooked and left behind. Alex Forsyth, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, let's talk to our political correspondent Ben Wright and our Europe correspondent Damien Grammaticus. Damien, if I could start with you. There's obvious impatience in Europe for a Brexit timetable. Can the UK be forced to speed things up?
Well, Clive, we've had some clarity on this from the European Union this evening, a statement making two things very clear. The process will only begin if there is a formal letter or a formal notification in a speech by David Cameron to leaders here. So when he comes next week, if he simply chats about it in the margins, that will not count. The second thing is that the negotiations about withdrawal will only begin after that negotiation, so nobody can think there'll be any pre-talks. You're serious or you're not. And intriguingly, it adds this:
If it is indeed the intention of the British government to leave the EU, it is therefore in its interest to notify as soon as possible. Intriguing because of that word if it is indeed the intention. Does that leave open wiggle room? Well, we don't know. What it makes clear is the ball is in the UK's court. The EU is serious, it's waiting to hear.
OK, Damien, thanks for that. Ben, to you, after all yesterday's excitement and in the wake of the historic vote, it seems like today was a bit of an anticlimax.
Yeah, that's true, Clive. And in contrast to some of those demands we're hearing from European politicians, today has been strangely quiet in British politics after that referendum earthquake. And I think there are several reasons. The first is that politicians, government ministers, leading Vote Leave campaigners and politicians have simply gone to ground because they're so dazed about what's happened. They're coming to terms with the new reality. And for Vote Leave leaders, there is no roadmap for what happens next. So they're having to regroup, have conversations between themselves and make a plan. Secondly, the Prime Minister's decision not to invoke that Article 50 while he remains in office, so not until the autumn when there is another Prime Minister, has brought a window of breathing space for everybody to think. And as Damien was saying there, it is quite clear that that decision to invoke Article 50 will be the responsibility of the new Prime Minister. Thirdly, there is a Tory party leadership contest cranking up, and I imagine the contenders for that will want to make the deal that Britain gets part of their pitch to the Tory faithful. But the resignation of Lord Hill today showed that the separation between the EU and the UK has started. Divorce, though, will not be quick and it will not be easy.
OK, Ben, thanks for that. Ben right there at Westminster, and Damien Grammaticus in Brussels. Many thanks. Now, the BBC understands HSBC Bank will move up to 1,000 staff from London to Paris if Britain leaves the single market. The relocated workers process payments made in euros for the bank. The announcement comes amid fresh warnings of the possible impact of the Brexit vote on London's financial institutions. Here's our economics correspondent, Andy Verity.
Voters were warned a Brexit would hit the city, and it was no empty threat. Today we learned HSBC is making plans to shift 1,000 workers to Paris if trade talks don't work out as it hopes. US investment banks JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley have similar plans. A leading Eurozone finance minister said that was a price of Brexit.
In the Asian market, for example, the Brits took out a full-page advert in the Financial Times, and the ad said, if you want to do business in Europe, come to London as a springboard to Europe. Now they can't place that ad. If Asians want to do business in Europe, they should come to Amsterdam or Frankfurt or Paris. That's unavoidable.
Why should the rest of the country care if the city loses some of the business it does for the Eurozone? Well, it's not just a few thousand jobs, it's also tax money coming into the Treasury. And the Treasury would have to find that from somewhere else, either by deeper spending cuts or by higher taxes on the rest of us. It could have to find even more money if our credit rating is downgraded, something the rating agency Moody's has said it's considering. The government might have to pay higher interest rates to service its growing debts. British companies export around £20 billion of financial services to the single market. So-called passporting rights mean they can do business easily in any member state. Losing those rights would hurt, but still wouldn't cause an exodus.
Banks are not going to flee en masse from the city. What banks are going to do is actually when they develop new areas, new departments, they may well find other areas to place them. Maybe Dublin, maybe Frankfurt. So it means after 3 or 4 years, you look back and you suddenly find, actually, there are areas of the bank, areas of the city, which are no longer here. They've gone elsewhere. So it won't happen immediately, it happens over time.
One chink of light in the gathering city gloom. Financial services firms could keep all their business in the single market if we struck a Norway-style trade deal. But then we'd have to accept free movement of people. And that might just be a deal-breaker. Andy Verity, BBC News, The City.
More than 2 million people have signed an online petition on Parliament's website calling for a rerun of the referendum. Thursday's ballot revealed a country deeply divided, with the outcome delighting many and appalling others. Our correspondent Robert Hall reports now from Leicester.
Harmony on a sunny Saturday. A local choir festival serenading voters who are still digesting the events of the past 48 hours. Although Leicestershire as a whole chose the Brexit route, this cosmopolitan city voted by a narrow margin to remain. Here, around 30% of young voters were comfortable with close ties to Europe and dismayed at the final decision to leave.
A lot of young people are very worried. Yeah, I think worried's a good word to use, because we just simply now don't know what's going to happen. It's a big leap into the dark, to be honest with you.
Michael and his girlfriend Poppy, campaigning on Leicester's doorsteps, had heard the concerns mirrored across the UK.
When I was campaigning, immigration was a huge issue for people. Many people were worried that our country was being stretched beyond our resources, that immigration was having a negative impact on the jobs for British people.
This article underlines my comedy credential.
Round the corner, at an impromptu stand-up comedy performance, I found more disappointment.
Oh, I felt sick. I felt really sick. I was quite nervous about it anyway, but I really thought that we would remain.
Outside the city, the Leave vote had been conclusive, though customers in this nail bar differed in their reasons for saying no to Europe.
I did think about it a lot, and I looked at a lot of the reasons why in and out, and I think I voted out because the people that are in the country now need to be looked after.
I drove to Braunston, a suburb 3 miles away. Outside a shop on a sprawling estate, Paul and Alfie told me the referendum was their first visit to a polling station.
Never gone out my way to do it, but like this man here said, it's the only time we thought we'd make a difference, so we make the vote count. So.
Would you vote in the next general election?
Never.
Everyone I knew voted out.
Because?
Because of change. We want change. I've got 2 little girls. I mean, kids' future's important and that. And at the end of the day, it can't get any worse, can it?
I don't think a lot will come out of it. I think it will stay pretty much the same, but we'll be out the EU.
The city and the region may not be singing from the same sheet, but one thing unites them. Until they see the detail of an eventual deal, there'll be no applause. Robert Hall, BBC News, Leicester.
To other news now, and Avon and Somerset police are continuing to question a 45-year-old man arrested on Thursday on suspicion of the murder of Melanie Hall. She disappeared after leaving a nightclub in Bath in 1996, but her body wasn't found until 2009, discovered near the M5 at Thornbury. Police had issued a new appeal for information on the 20th anniversary of her disappearance earlier this month. The former Conservative Cabinet Minister, Lord Mayhew, has died at the age of 86. He'd been suffering from cancer and Parkinson's disease. He was the longest-serving Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, holding the post for 6 years during the 1990s, and was also Attorney General. He stood down from the Commons in 1997. And thousands of people took to the streets of central London today under rainbow flags for the biggest ever Pride Parade, the annual celebration of gay culture. The march stopped for a minute to remember those who died in the mass shooting at a gay club in Orlando, in Florida, earlier this month. Now, with all the sport, here's Lizzie Greenwood-Hughes at the BBC Sports Centre. Hi there, Lizzie.
Hello, Clive. Thank you very much. Good evening. Wales have beaten Northern Ireland to a place in the quarter-finals of the European Championship, winning a tense, tight game in Paris. The two sides only divided by an own goal. Our sports editor, Dan Roan, reports.
These fans have made plenty of friends here in France, determined to enjoy every minute of the Euros, having waited so long to be in them. But with both Wales and Northern Ireland exceeding all expectations here, neither wanted it to end now. This a piece of sporting history, the first time two home nations had met in a knockout match at a major tournament. Northern Ireland started well. Goalkeeper Wayne Hennessy forced into action, first by Stuart Dallas. Should have taken the lead after the restart. Aaron Ramsey's cross deserving better than this from Sam Vokes. Northern Ireland living dangerously, and they and their fans will be sorely missed.
To lose as we did, the nature of the goal, it's very, very disappointing. You know, I thought we gave everything. Couldn't ask any more for the players over the whole tournament.
In the semi-finals of Euro 2016, having had to wait 58 years to qualify for a major tournament, they're making the absolute most of this opportunity and will now believe they can go all the way. Dan Rowan, BBC News, Paris.
England's rugby union side capped a sensational season with an historic 3-0 series whitewash over Australia, winning the final test in Sydney 44 points to 40. Scotland were also successful in their tour of Japan, but there were defeats for Wales and Ireland. Adam Wilde rounds up all the day's action.
On the other side of the world, a chance for England to show how far they've come. A series win secure, but this is a side that wanted their victory complete. Pride can be a strong motivator. That's all Australia had to play for. They were ahead just at the break, but a thrilling first half then made way for a quite dizzying second. Overall, the lead was taken and then lost no fewer than 10 times. But the decisive moments came from an England boot, one way or another. Here, Jamie George seeing the ball rebound into his path to score. The boot of Owen Farrell doing the rest. The first touring side to complete such a comprehensive series victory in Australia for a generation. For England, a true whitewash. It secures their status as the world's second best side. The best? Well, that remains firmly New Zealand. A crushing 46-6 defeat of Wales, the All Blacks providing a chastening end to Wales' long season. Japan are an emerging force in the game. They'll host the next World Cup. They took the lead against a disjointed Scotland, seemingly to the approval of the Emperor and Empress. Scotland couldn't find a try of their own. 7 penalties, though, was just enough for victory. Ireland let slip their chance to create history in South Africa. The series decider ending in narrow, agonising defeat and frustration. Adam Wilde, BBC News.
And that's the sport. Back to you, Clive.
Lizzie, many thanks for that. And that's it. You can see more on all of today's stories on the BBC News channel, but from me and the rest of the team, have a very good night.
Good evening. Well, many places saw some pretty